rights and individual freedom, free and equal for all in matters political, social, and state. From the civil rights era, we learned of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, and many others who led the way for the fight of civil equality. Through history, we've learned of the tactics, reactions, and emotions of those who both supported and opposed the issues. During the civil rights era, many risked their lives in the name of freedom and equality. Civil rights movements were demonstrated all over these United States, but most do not know that right here in our town of Jacksonville, there was a time when sit-ins, demonstrations, and protests occurred. Most do not even know of the day known as Axe Handle Saturday, when downtown Jacksonville erupted on August 27, 1960. To help everyone become familiar with this day in history, I'm going to tell you a little about what people were fighting for, where demonstrations, protests, and sit-ins occurred, and about that Saturday. First, what are civil rights and what was all the fighting about? Nearly 100 years after the end of all slavery was written into law, many African Americans were still living in an unequal world. The South remained plagued by segregation, oppression, and racial violence. Jacksonville was no different. In the article Civil Rights Movements from Exploring Florida, it tells us that the major issue was segregation of blacks and whites. Black children were not getting the same public education that was offered to white children. They could not attend the same schools, and African American schools lacked proper learning materials, supplies, teacher, and funding. Segregation of public bathrooms, water fountains, and local establishments were all separated by the fine line of black and white. When word spread south that racial barriers were being lowered elsewhere, Southern protesters began to wage a war against segregation. For those who struggled to gain equal rights, they faced fear, hatred, and violence from those who opposed the changes. Not only did African Americans have to worry about the white opposers, they also had to fear the police, because when blacks often spoke out against discrimination, they were arrested. As civil rights rallies grew and civil rights groups began to emerge in southern states, and this was known as the Southern Freedom Movement, which led way for freedom, respect, dignity, as well as economic and social equality. An article in the Global Nonviolent Database titled Jacksonville Students Sit-In for the Integrated Lunch Counters explains that in 1960, Jacksonville was one of the biggest southern cities with a high African American population. The current mayor, W. Hayden Burns, supported the legal order to segregate all department store, eating establishments, and public facilities. He also refused the biracial council, who would advise on racial issues in fear that it could lead to integration. During the spring of 1960, a student campaign joined together, and on March 13th, they held their first white-only lunch counter sit-in. After a few demonstrations, which most ended badly due to the opposition of the mayor and store managers, the students' campaign had to halt all their sit-ins and demonstrations. The students' break was short-lived, and the students began a new campaign. A group of African American students formed at Edward Waters College. These students, known as the Youth Council, studied, trained, and learned peaceful protesting and nonviolent principles, all the while preparing for violent confrontation. Global Nonviolent Action Database tells us that on August 13th, the Youth Council began by going into different stores and purchasing small items. Then they began to take seats filling all white lunch counters. The store owners were forced to shut down. The Youth Council repeated this action during the next few days in hopes to persuade the store owners and managers to change their minds. During the demonstration, there were some occasions of hostility, verbal attacks, physical and intentional pokes to the back of the Youth Council. On August 18th, store owners placed a policy only allowing 2 demonstrators in an establishment at a time. Protests then turned to the streets and sidewalks. Over the next 9 days, emotions and hostility brewed on both sides of the line. There were incidents of physical shoving, verbal attacks, and even small fights between groups of African American women, African American, and white females. Reports made to police about these incidents fell on deaf ears. When Jacksonville City Police did act, they were arresting the demonstrators. This fact made it quite clear to the Youth Council that they had no legal support. It made it clear that they had to defend themselves against those who opposed. On the eve of August 27th, some of Jacksonville's white community decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands. That evening, white men bought up the stock of axe handles and baseball bats from the local department and hardware stores. On the morning of Axe Handle Saturday, members of the local KKK and White Citizens Council gathered in Hemming Park. Wielding their axe handles, baseball bats, and billy clubs, they were demanding that local establishments remain segregated. The Youth Council sensed the tension growing and decided that they were going to enter downtown in small groups and from different locations throughout the city. Some of the Youth Council encountered axe-handle-wielding men and women and ran the other way. Some were dragged away from lunch counters and beaten. When a group of approximately 30 Youth Council demonstrators came out of one establishment, a group of approximately 300 white men, brandishing their weapons, began to beat any African American they saw, including innocent bystanders. In a Florida Times-Union article titled "Axe Handle Saturday, Alton Yates risked his life for a principle," it states that it wasn't until a few African American gangs who brung their own weapons did the police step in and intervene. According to police estimation, approximately 50 people were injured enough to be treated for a variety of injuries. Police arrested 62, 48 of which were African American. Through my speech, I hope that you were informed on a little history of a Jacksonville civil rights event that you may not have ever heard of. I hope that in turn you will share this story of Axe Handle Saturday with another. As I stated in the beginning, not many know of the events of that Saturday in August of 1960. I feel the reason it has gone unknown is the lack of news surrounding that day. During the day following the event, the story made headlines throughout the world. But here in Jacksonville, it was forbidden to publicize any and all events of that day on August 27, 1960. Axe Handle Saturday was an embarrassment to our city and all the city officials. For me, I'm embarrassed that Axe Handle Saturday isn't acknowledged as much as it should be. I have lived in this town my entire 37 years, and just recently did I learn of this historical event. We as a world struggle with equality for all in one way or another. I feel that this little piece of Jacksonville history should be shared to show how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. Thank you.